Good evening. Good evening. Hey, thanks for coming out. We're seated in the front row are most of the members of the Mayor's Task Force on Community Violence. This has been a long process, about 15 months, and we've been meeting twice a month, sometimes more with forums and events and work groups. We very early on, I'm Michael Trapp. I'm the Second Ward City Council representative for the City of Columbia, and I've also been a co-chair of the task force with Laura Nauser, who represents the Fifth Ward. She asked me to just present some opening remarks. Early in the process, you know, this whole incident began with some high-profile shooting incidents. There was an incident downtown, and then there were a couple high-profile homicides of last year in May and June. And that awoke the community to what I have come to see is really more of a chronic problem than a crisis. It is a crisis in some communities for every family who is involved in these situations. It's a tragedy, but it's more like diabetes than a broken leg. It's not a short-term crisis that you just need a cast and a fix, but it's something that needs ongoing management, that as we've examined possible solutions, it doesn't look like to me like that there's one silver bullet that's going to take care of this, that there's one single answer, but there are going to be a lot of solutions that added up, we can really make an impact on the community. From early on, when Laura and I first met, we didn't want to own the process. We didn't have a result in mind. There was nothing, but we wanted to bring the members of the task force together and then really set up a process. And I think David really commented that we were really more facilitators than chairs of this process. But we didn't have an outcome in mind, but we decided to pull the group together with a loose framework and then talk amongst the group of how we're going to move forward. What we decided to do was to meet twice a month and to first examine the local conditions. And so we examined through media reports, through offender data, from personal experiences, from knowing people who are both victims and perpetrators. So from our firsthand knowledge, from reaching out to social service providers, we looked at every possible piece of evidence that we could look at, as well as examining the national research. And so we identified what were the local conditions, what were the drivers, and then from that we began to examine best practices under a loose framework of what we've called the 4 pillars: prevention, intervention, enforcement, and reentry. And so we've looked at each of those. We set up work groups to examine those issues and to make recommendations really to the community. Their recommendations, some of the recommendations are city council specific, they're policy recommendations, others are broader, and there's copies in the back if you haven't seen those, and the report will go in front of the city council. I believe it is at the December 3rd? Is that a Monday? November 17th. So this coming, I want to get through November. So we'll be making members of the task force will be making that presentation and formally presenting our results. But really, even though it's called the Mayor's Task Force on Community Violence, we really feel that, you know, we've represented the citizens of Columbia. And so before we make that presentation to City Council, we want to make the presentation to those interested citizens. At our listening sessions, we asked if that was something that people wanted to hear, and people said they wanted us to come back. So I'm going to ask representatives for each. I think we're going to have the chairperson of each of the work groups come forward and then present the recommendations for each of those pillars, and then we'll take questions. So we do have, Mike would ask people who do have questions or comments to come up to the mic, and so that, because this is going out on the city channel, so I want to make sure that your voice is heard. So I will turn it to, our first is prevention, correct? Okay, and that's Pamela Harden. Thank you, Pam.
Good evening. We'll just kind of go down through, I guess, the list of the information that you have before you and kind of give you just a little insight on what we were meaning with each of those areas. To start is the research cure violence, and it was to employ violence reduction strategies that treat violence like a disease and support parenting and early childhood programs that ensure the best start in life. We were really concerned with young people getting a great start when it comes to going to school. Preschool, beginning to start school at an early age has been proven to be the best form of engaging young people in the educational process. And so we thought that that would play a major role by giving these young people a jump start on going to school and being more supportive of some of the programs that they have out there that are available for these young people to be able to attend school and get the support that they needed. The second thing, increase awareness of existing job training programs and strengthen partnerships between the schools and the city and nonprofit around the job training, examine and evaluate the effectiveness and accessibility of microloan, entrepreneurial, and small business development programs for at-risk populations such as CARE and things like that. We saw this as a need for young people to be more aware. One of the things that we were told was that there was not a specific area where people could go and get all this or obtain all this information at one place. It was always kind of sporadically spread around town. And so we were thinking that by placing this information in an area and making it very accessible where people can go and get all that information in one locale would be beneficial to that person. And also to be able to have a lot more engagement between the city and some job training for young people, effectiveness, the entrepreneurial, be able to put out some programs that would encourage young people to become entrepreneurs and take some of the talents that they have and be able to show them or direct them in the path that would be good for them to utilize some of this talent that they have as opposed to letting it go to waste or using it in a destructive manner. So we felt like that would be very important, and to expand, CARE only has so many positions open, so we need to make some other places readily available for our young people so that they have accessibility to some of these other programs. Develop and strengthen community and city communication tools that list and direct people to community resources, programming opportunities for youth and families. New and existing tools will require frequent updates to keep us up with the changing program availability. And so we thought with this to develop and strengthen the community and the city communications that it would be beneficial, because a lot of times the programs that are out there are not exactly explained or understood like they should be. So we felt like with getting a little bit better communication between the city, that would help strengthen those communication tools. And also with the resources, the young people and their families. So that was a program we were thinking would be great to put together for that. Next was to examine our process for social services funding and ensure that it is fair and open, to educate and build capacity for new programs and organizations from the African American community, ensure that a funding applicant's effort to provide cultural competency training to its staff is considered, set aside increased funding towards violent prevention. We were interested in the fact that the social services funding, we wanted to make sure that it was fair and open and that people were not limited. And so we thought that this would be a way. A lot of times people they have situations or they've had problems, they've had different things, and they have to turn to social services for this funding, and there are certain things that prevent this from happening. So we were thinking by making it fair and more open, and then having some cultural training on how to address individuals with these problems We know that a lot of times in the African American community, there are a lot of different situations that go on, and sometimes people don't have are not approachable. And so this was a means to make people more approachable and more receptive to the problems that are out there with these individuals. And so we were wanting that to be considered to be more open and a little more training on some sensitivity when it came to that. Increased support, promotion, and accountability of the Neighborhood Watch program to expand its into new neighborhoods. A lot of people have expressed the concern to have the more funding and more have it be more let's see, out in the open with the Neighborhood Watch. In other words, the programs have dwindled a little bit in some of the different neighborhoods, and so to give them some kind of support to expand these areas, we thought would help with the increase on, or to help decrease some of the violence in those areas. The city shall host an annual forum involving neighborhood organizations, churches, public schools, CPD, family services divisions, and other interested parties to address social need, crime, and discrimination. We had those 3 forums, and we thought that the forums were very receptive. We thought it was very interesting how people received or were welcoming to the fact that we were there to listen and not there to just talk to them. And so we thought that by having more forums, having more open meetings, more meetings where we're able to listen and hear what the community wants, that would bring us jointly together and help us deal with not only just the crime, but with the different issues of the different races, different cultural things, but it would make it open for us to be able to address a lot of the issues that we have going on today, because as we go through the rest of this forum, you're going to hear about different areas that we've discussed, different things that have been proposed to be put forth before you. And all of this came out of not just our meetings, but with all of the things that we studied and with all of the forums, we compiled all this together. And so that would be an opportunity for not only it to be presented to you, but for you to be able to give your opinion back and make sure that we're all on one accord when we're doing what we're doing. So we felt like an annual forum would be something that would be beneficial to Columbia any way that you would look at it. It would be something that everybody could engage in and be a part of. The last thing, the use of the city channel in conjunction with Columbia Public Schools to create positive programming highlighting youth activities and involvement in the community. Of course, we can always increase on our usage of our city channel, and it would only benefit us for us to utilize that through the work through the Columbia Public Schools to benefit our young people. It's an access channel that's there and readily available, and so we should take full advantage of that, and utilizing that and being able to work in conjunction with Columbia Public Schools would be a benefit to our young people. And so basically what we're trying to do with the prevention is to start out the young people on the right foot so that we can keep them from going in the wrong path by providing them with some opportunities that will entice them to kind of direct their efforts on things that they like to do in a positive manner as opposed to a negative manner. So with the prevention, we tried to come up with some ways that would ensure that our young people would be preoccupied, and hopefully preoccupied in a positive way that would keep them or deter them from going down the wrong path, and that is for prevention.
Does anyone have any questions or comments regarding the prevention recommendations? Okay, then we'll move on to intervention.
Appreciate your attendance here this evening. As Pam was pointing out, one of the things that the task force considered very strongly was we needed the input from the community. The reason that we're having this session this evening is that a number of people wanted to know, how are we going to know that you have listened to us and what your recommendations are? And so that's why we wanted to have this session this evening before it goes to the city council on Monday. My area is in the intervention. A lot of these overlap a great deal, but just to kind of summarize very quickly, I would say 4 key areas under intervention is to create a youth community center. We feel that it's not available currently, and that's something that we need, a high priority. Implement a violence interrupters program, increase the number of available mentors in the community, increase Columbia Public Schools' ability to identify and help at-risk students. To go back and give a little bit more detail on those 4 recommendations, throughout our task force meetings, and especially during the public forums, as Pamela has already mentioned, there was a clear need to create youth facilities and to train people by providing safe places, trusted people to turn to, and engage community building programs that are appealing to the youth. Side note on that means we're going to have to listen to the youth. It can't be 60, 50, 40, 30-year-olds establishing what a 13, 14, 15-year-old wants or needs. These facilities and people need to be reflective of our community's diversity so that everyone who uses them feels comfortable and welcomed. That's a strong recommendation that we have because we don't feel that there is a place where youth can go to presently. Under the copy that you have, the communities need to expand the youth-oriented spaces, programs, activities that focus on cultural and educational curriculum throughout the city. An example is the parking lot adjacent to the Armory should be considered as an opportunity for the creation of a youth community cultural center where the staff and programming reflects the diversity in the community it serves. Support the implementation of a family access center to provide a safe and neutral facility where the youth and their families can obtain the necessary community services in an effort to divert negative behaviors in youth before they escalate. The center would also be a place that law enforcement could utilize to allow a child to obtain the necessary services without placing the child within the framework of the juvenile justice system. Partner with the University of Missouri and other local colleges to improve participation in mentoring programs and increase the number of minority mentors. This could be done through academic rewards, class credit, the sororities and the fraternities participation, or other incentives. View quality mentors as a community resource that needs to be used efficiently and allowed to grow. Processes are needed for including rehabilitative offenders as mentors. Establish a program based on best practices where community members and school facilitators who facilitate violence interruption and mediation activities, something similar to the Chicago motto, violence interpreters or interrupters or street soldiers. It's been in the news in the last week as far as the expansion that Columbia Public Schools is doing in some of their mediation programs. We didn't have a chance to specifically look at that from a task force standpoint. I think it's steps headed in the right direction. But what we're wanting to do is to encourage looking at the Chicago model. The Columbia Public Schools system should more actively engage in intervening in a student's lives by identifying risk factors earlier. We're talking here about deficiencies in academic performance and attendance, and then acting on these issues immediately with long-term individual academic plans and not wait until an IEP is mandated. The IEP is the individualized performance, the individualized education program that comes in under special education. In many cases, we feel that if the students have the proper intervention early, they're not going to be left in a situation where they need an IEP. School resource officers need to be in middle schools and high school buildings. Currently, it's my understanding we have 4, and they are in the 4 high schools, not in any other buildings. This provides an opportunity for building a trusting relationship between the officers and the students. It basically is non-existent today as far as that trust. That's going to be covered later in another one of our reports. Columbia Public Schools needs to adopt strategies to help minimize the negative impacts of students switching school districts frequently. And it's not so much switching school districts, it's switching schools within the district. What we're encouraging, this may include standard curriculums on core academic studies, math, reading, and the policies, especially discipline, that apply to all children in order to address the district-wide mobility issues. What we're really saying is that there's a lot of mobility, there's a lot of movement from, and I can't name all the elementary schools. I think we've got, 23 now, or we'll have 23 in 6 middle schools and 4 high schools. What we're saying is that there needs to be consistency so that if an individual is moving from Lang to Field or Alpha, Hart, Lewis, there shouldn't be any interruption as far as the discipline. There shouldn't be any interruption as far as the curriculum. That is not the case at the present time. A child should be able to move from one school to another and not become displaced in their academic studies. Unfortunately, what happens when that occurs, they may be ahead or they may be behind of where that particular building is at on the math curriculum or on the reading curriculum. If they're behind, how are they going to catch up? That's why we're indicating the need for a coordinated effort between to be able to assure consistencies. This is the subcommittee report on intervention. Any questions? Yes. Yeah. You might use the phone. Yeah. Use the phone, use the mic.
And I I was listening to you when you was talking about the police. I know that's an ongoing thing, but sometimes we get police that are not sensitive to. What process would you use to kind of weed out the ones that you don't really want in the school, and have a mentoring? Because we had one police officer, I won't say no name, that when my kids was going to school, none of the kids in the African American community liked this police officer. Or confrontations pretty much daily with the students. Stop over by Hickman High School. I had encountered him a few times where I thought he was, overboard with his policing, and that's my biggest concern, is that we, have input in who's.
I think it's an excellent question, Bishop Harden.
Yeah, we have some say in kind of training they might have, dealing with young people and things.
Let me respond to it just briefly. Part of that's going to be addressed under the enforcement task force, but one of the things that we discussed as the task force as a whole is the need, the police officers and the teachers are professionals, quote, unquote, should be, and therefore should be expected to act accordingly. And as far as those that can remember transactional analysis, when you had the adult, the parent, and the child, too many times we get faced with a situation where you may have a 13, 14-year-old interacting with an official, and the official is interacting on the same level. They should be able to maintain that appropriate decorum, not authoritarian, but understanding. And that's why, and again, I don't want to get into another recommendation, but will be coming up as far as the necessity for making sure that our professionals in CPD or CPS understand the diversity in our community and have the ability to handle that with the students. Because if they do not understand that diversity, it can definitely impact. And unfortunately, it's going to be the African Americans that are usually the victims of the circumstances. And it should not be that way. We want to see the inequities and inequalities eliminated as much as possible. Other question?
I'm really pleased to see the recommendations overall and in this section, and in particular, the recommendations in this section call attention to the fact that the task force appropriately, while it was called into existence by the city council, by the in-depth look that it said we need to kind of figure out what's going on, really is speaking to the city, the county, the school district, actually state agencies, the local NGO community, and the community as a whole. And it comes forward in particular with these recommendations in this section, very much, but not entirely directed to the school district. And I must admit, for me, in the 90s, many of us had identified, in our neighborhood, we used to have Field Elementary. And this issue about the enormous disadvantage to students may be switching schools 3 times a year. This would, to make this work, to have a relatively equal educational opportunity across all K through 8th grades, basically elementary and middle school, would require an enormous amount of investment. But the first part of it is what you put in your last point, identifying just how big an issue this is. In particular, we talk about the achievement gap. In many ways, putting those kind of resources into addressing this transient. So I'm really pleased. Now, this is now 20 years later, but to see it as such a core part of your recommendations from this group, looking from a different perspective than, for instance, my neighborhood was looking at. We wanted a really good elementary school there as part of the basis for our neighborhood. We're looking at. So I'm very, very pleased with it. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind, would you identify yourself?
Oh, my name's John Clark, and I've been with the North Central Columbia Neighborhood Association and have worked on these kind of issues. I'm very pleased with your work.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Any other questions? If not, I'll turn it back to Mike. Let me just mention, from a task force member, is that we were very appreciative to have the 2 council members serving as facilitators. And it was fairly intense for the last 15 months. And over the long haul, they've been there. They did not dictate their agenda. They facilitated our discussion. Sometimes I didn't envy them in the position they had to be in, but I just want to acknowledge their role in that. And the other thing I'd like to just mention is out of the 13 task force members that the mayor appointed, if you look at that, it's a very diverse group. That's both as far as ethnic, racial, gender, and I think you could even say somewhat economic. And it was a good group to be able to work with as a whole. I'm not saying that we came out 100% in agreement every time, but we had a lot of good discussions. Normally, it was at the retreats where the discussion really occurred, because in a 2-hour session, you can't really get into the in-depth discussion that you need. That's why we had 4 retreats. That's a day long on a Saturday. So that's 4 Saturdays out of that 15-month period that the task force also gave up, because they had committed, they wanted to help solve these problems. Mike?
Well, I'm sorry to plague you again with my presence, as both bringing the introductory remarks and presenting the enforcement recommendations. But I was the chair of that work group, and I worked with Jerry Taylor and Lorenzo Lawson and Mike Hayes, who brought a lot of real invaluable insight as a retired Columbia police officer. David's more general remarks reminded me of a couple of points that I wish I would have mentioned in my opening remarks, is that we did decide to make our recommendations, our approach, a consensus-based model. So even though we may not be in total agreement with every piece, every member, but we could all live with it. And that was really important, that we didn't just want good recommendations to improve our community, but we wanted to do it in a very open and inclusive process that included and honored the voices of the people present. We also were very open to the public, where we took public comment at each of our meetings, and when we broke into work group sessions, we would just bring whoever came could sit down and work with us on those work sessions. So for all of the people who contributed to what we've done, I'm very, very thankful. The real essence, I guess, and another person that I really need to thank is the author of this report, and our staff liaison, Leland Rahard, who really did yeoman-like work. Laura and I prided ourselves on being more of a facilitator than laying our vision on the task force. Leland was even much more so. He was truly a great example of servant leadership. There's very little of Leland's perspective, but a lot of Leland's work. He truly listened to what we were trying to do and helped us reach consensus and kept us on track, and was really a great credit to the city. Enforcement recommendations, we wrestled very early as, except for Mike Hayes, we didn't have the technological expertise to fully understand what changes need to make within the police department, but we were all in agreement that there is undoubtedly change that needs to be made in the Columbia Police Department. We had immediately kind of focused on kind of twin issues of respect and resources, that we saw the need for more community policing, relationship building. What came out of the Columbia Public Schools testimony and the police testimony was partnerships with people who are in communities that struggle with violence. That we need to get past the barriers that have separated us, that we really need to be one community. We've seen in events in other parts of the state the risk that you take when your police are separate from the people that they are supposed to be serving. We need to have one community, not only for our own safety, for our own vision of what it means to be a community, but even for our own economic prosperity. Columbia is fundamentally a tourist town. The university is the economic driver, the lifeblood of the city of Columbia. What really makes us, one of the things that makes us unique, and they are on a model where they require students to come in from out of state. We need, those students to come to the university because of decreasing state support. That out-of-state tuition provides the economic foundation. The sports tourism, the people who come to Columbia for our cultural events. All of that is at risk if we do not have adequate public safety measures in place to not only ensure that we are safe in Columbia, but that we all feel safe. And we need that as residents, and especially in those communities more impacted by violence. The research that really struck me was the power of social networks. That if you know someone or know someone who knows someone who's a victim of homicide, you're 100 times more likely to be a victim of homicide yourself. So there are some, I mentioned that I felt that this was a chronic issue and a crisis, but for many communities within Columbia, it is a crisis, and folks are at risk, and they have every right to be concerned and to reach out for better support to both solve these crimes and take those offenders off the street and prevent these crimes from ever occurring. So specifically in regards to law enforcement, trust between the community and local law enforcement agencies is a clear theme. While we agree that the Columbia Police Department is headed in the right direction, there's still work to do to build trust, especially with the African American community. We agree with the CPD's push for more officers to pursue community policing. We're not going to be able to do a lot of community policing activities with the existing resources. We're going to have to find additional policing resources to be able to move into a community policing approach which highlights partnership. The trust gap, what we termed the gap, the divide between the African American community and the police, needs to be aggressively addressed both by the police department and the community. The Columbia Police Department does need to change the way that they do business, but also we as community members need to do everything in our power to restore the trust between the community and the police department. As long as we raise our children to fear the police, then there's going to continue to be this divide. We believe that building community trust may be the most cost-effective way to expand the reach of our police department to both solve and prevent violent crimes. We need proactive messaging and respectful communication. A part of the training program has been this idea of universal respect. That is vital and critical for us to move forward, is to move that beyond just a training slogan, but something that's actualized in the real world. Every opportunity to communicate with the public, from the department website to press releases to every interaction that officers have with citizens, need to be done in a respectful way. We feel that cultural competency training and mentoring, that what's being done is not adequate, that it needs to be more robust, that it needs to involve diverse members of the community. Right now we have a police force that does not represent the City of Columbia. It doesn't look like the City of Columbia. And in order to change that, we need to change the culture of the police department to make sure that it's welcoming to people of all races. And so through cultural competency training shouldn't be, a mandatory training where you just go through the motions to do it on an annual basis because that's what the standards say that you should do. But it needs to be something, many of us had been part of cultural competency trainings that were powerful, and in all of those experiences, they were with a diverse group of folks. That if you're going to learn about diverse cultures, you need the participation of diverse cultures. We believe that the cultural competency training program should be evaluated by an experienced third party with an ongoing process of accountability that includes anonymous surveys by officers evaluating the training programs. We also believe that retired officers in the community should be used as a resource for training and mentoring our young police force. Again, we're looking for a system of accountability with independent verification and public participation in the vision, mission, and goals of the police department. We believe that the police department should be provided the funding, staff, and leadership to move beyond the responsive policing and positively engage the community. We believe that the Columbia Police Department should be provided with the resources and the leadership to attract, train, and retain the best officers. We need a system of professional development and promotion instituted that rewards skills like relationship building, community involvement, and cultural competency. We also believe that the Columbia community should develop programs to help officers feel appreciated and respected, that respect works both ways. We not only need respectful police officers, but we need people in the community to be respectful. And this is going to help us to recruit the highest quality officers that are representative of the diversity of Columbia. We feel that that is critical. We feel that City of Columbia should strive to provide the best pay and benefits to attract the best officers, as we have in years past. We believe that there should be community events involving children and youth to allow young people the opportunity to develop a positive view of the police. We believe that the community should create and expand home ownership and rental rebate programs to incentivize police officers to live in the neighborhoods they serve. The common theme is that we should be one community. The police need to be part of our community. Questions or comments?
Like I'm a member of the community. First, a comment just about the process that you guys have engaged. I've been very impressed and know of most of the members of your committee. So that to me was something that was very positive from the start. I also know that the two chair people, co-facilitators, are people who really do have a long-term commitment and knowledge of not only issues of violence, but issues around young people and fragile families. So I think you guys have brought great expertise. That's not going to be any criticism. While we always can have some differences in the goals, I think this so far is a very strong document that if in any way we could implement would really help our community. And that's where I thought you said something almost prophetic when we started, which is I learned that this is not an acute problem, it's a chronic problem. And the problem with chronic problems is we get used to them, kind of like that old joke about if you take a frog and you throw him in the hot water, he jumps out, but if the water slowly increases, he ultimately dies. I think the fact that we don't have a lot of people here tonight shows it is a chronic problem. So the question I'm going to ask, and I think somebody asked this at the community meeting that you had over at the health department, that I'd like to know about in this evening, or I will ask the city council in your roles as the city council people, is what are we going to do so that this hard work, this excellent document, doesn't become just one more piece of paper like some equally excellent reports we've had in the past that weren't implemented. And then I do want to say, I know this is a real tough area. I was talking to Dr. Stiefelman a number of times about bridging the education gap and how difficult that has been. And not to misquote him, but my impression in talking to his predecessor was that's not an area he was going to say, boy, Steve, I really did it. And I think our superintendents were both, the last one and this one are both excellent. But yet he said, that was an area of frustration. So you know, I know we have a hard task. In terms of the police department, I have one final comment. It's not about your report. And that's, I'm hoping we're moving in the right direction, but I think we've, you know, changing an organizational culture, getting to what's called a true community policing department, and they do exist. Our mayor has mentioned Ann Arbor, Michigan a number of times, and I spent a year living there, and he's very right about what an excellent police department that is. But I also know that we have a police department, it shocked me a number of years ago, where police who got too involved in the community under that side of the blue line used to say, well, he's too social worky. But here in Columbia, at least, and this is only hearsay from the other side of the blue line, some of the police officers that I considered those that I would want in my school system, that I would want interacting with children, those were the very police that the term I heard was used was they were hug-a-thug cops. So that the very organizational culture of our department, hopefully it is changing, discouraged those very officers who had the skill set to do the kind of things you want. And my final comment is this. I can't tell you demographically. There was a lot of reasons and a lot of different people, the reason that the property tax did not pass for the police department. However, and I'm not saying we're a majority, among a number of the people that I talked to, the concern was when I'm absolutely assured that the police department is moving in the right direction, I am willing to vote that tax. But I am going to vote for a tax increase for 40 new officers who will clearly be part of a community policing department. And I'm concerned that I would be voting for police officers where the department is more concerned about things like buying a $350,000 armored vehicle. So again, I do applaud you, and I do ask you as the very community leaders that you are, what are we going to do so that this document becomes implemented? Because as I said to Dr. Peterman, I said, normally my orientation is as a pessimist, but I'm willing to be an incremental optimist. So help me be that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Yeah, definitely appreciate those comments. And there's two things that are different in regards to this report and this task force. One is Ms. Nauser and I are members, so we're not just going to sit behind the dais and receive the report like we received lots of reports and add it onto our giant stack of giant reports. We've lived and bled and put a lot into this, and we are deeply familiar with the process that we got to this recommendation, and we're deeply supportive of this process of moving it forward. So having Ms. Nauser and I on council will, I think, help with the implementation process. In addition, we, as members of the mayor's task force, have decided that we've saw this process before. We're not the first task force to address similar issues, and not a lot was done with the last report in regards to racial relations. So we feel that it's important to continue our work, but in a different format. So we're going to reform ourselves as a citizens group and still have open public meetings, but not to be directly tied to the city, because we did find that some of the open meetings laws, in spite of its best of intentions to bring these forward, it doesn't allow things like email discussions and things that many people take for granted, and it doesn't allow for as many, open committee meetings and those things. So what I'm proposing, I missed a couple meetings towards the end with illness and travel, is that, sometime in the new year that we meet just as a group of citizens, see where we're at with the implementation process, and that we'll meet regularly to oversee that process, to make sure that it doesn't just become another report in the pile of reports, but that it is something that we're moving forward on. So I think all of us as task force members are deeply committed to that, and Ms. Nauser and I as council members are in a unique position to be able to see that we continue forward with the process. It certainly doesn't end here. Any other questions or comments in regards to enforcement? Please come to the mic.
Thank you.
Correct.
wondering where the youth are. Talked about ways
Okay.
as far as, I think that hearing other people's opinions, especially of the university, and although they are involved, but they go to Mizzou, it would be beneficial to have them involved in
Sure. Yeah, Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for coming out tonight. We didn't do a lot of outreach. I mean, a lot of us are, just to be frank, spent. We've been working on this for a long time. And so, you know, we did what we could, but we're also meeting on a weekly basis as we came towards the end stretch to finalize the report. So as one of the things that we've talked about doing as a citizens group is having some kind of an annual forum, which would have, you know, a lot better outreach. And definitely, we're going to need to involve young people. As, you know, certainly when we look within, you know, who commits the most violent acts, it's young men in their 20s. And even before that, if we're going to reach those young men, the younger that we can catch them. So we recognize that youth is vital. We did the youth forum that you participated in, and we had some youth participation in our meetings, but nowhere near what we need. There are larger city council movements towards a youth commission for that high school age group, because we recognize that the youth voice is not as present in city affairs as it needs to be. And if we're going to instill civic engagement and community involvement and being involved in positive activities, all of those things are preventative against the kinds of things that we're talking about. We need to do a better job of it. And so it's a huge unmet need. I will say that, you know, as we move for an annual forum next year as a citizens group, we'll definitely make youth outreach and more outreach in general a big part of what we did. But we did not do a whole lot of outreach for tonight. And that shows. We've generally found, and I think this is true, that public involvement has really met how much we reached out and how much we did. And we really focused those heavy efforts on the listening sessions, the public forums, and less so for this. This was more that something that people had asked for at the forums, and we brought it for those people who were involved.
Yeah, and I also want to apologize too, because I'm up to date on everything.
Sure.
I know there's a lot of programs within the elementary schools like that. Member of the fraternity and sororities that come out, and then it's not asking a lot. You're not asking for everybody, but you're asking for one person who can get information back to the rest of the group, share it, and then it can spread that way.
Oh.
Definitely. Yeah, that's what I was saying. I can
Yeah.
definitely, I would love to pass out and go and speak gatherings about what is discussed.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. As a citizens group, we won't be bound by a particular number, and we'll be able to bring in some new folks, and definitely we would appreciate your help. Any other questions or comments on this, or is there anyone from the task force who wanted to comment on any of the questions or comments we received so far? Okay. All right, so we're going to next talk about reentry.
I'm Dan Hannikin. I'm representing the reentry recommendations. And we were tasked to develop recommendations that would reduce violent crime in our community. So I felt at an advantage with the reentry group, because that's a group that's already been in trouble. We don't have to try to guess who's at risk or elsewise. So a couple foundations that led to these recommendations. One, most of the experts in the field agree that a majority of the crime is committed by a minority of the criminals, not a minority of the general population. But right now in the state of Missouri, there's about 2% of the general population that's on probation, parole, or in prison. But a small percentage of that 2% is responsible for most of the crime that we see in our community. So having that knowledge, we thought it would be important to identify in the city of Columbia who are those highest risk offenders, the ones in our community that are at the highest risk of committing violent crime. And we need to find out who those individuals are, and we can do that through an assessment process. And then we would single these individuals out, and we would do something similar to what they're doing in the city of Kansas City, which is called the NOVA program. And basically what they do in Kansas City, it's a weed and seed type approach, which means they want to offer all the supports necessary for violent offenders to be released from prison and to successfully transition back into our community. But with that support and with those resources comes additional accountability. So if you don't change your behaviors, we're going to be much quicker to intervene. So we weed out the people that are not willing to take advantage of the resources in this community, and we do it quickly before more victims are taken and before life sentences need to be handed out. And if you are willing to make the changes, we want to be there to support you, to encourage you, and to connect you to all the information necessary so that you can successfully transition back. So the first recommendation is identify this group. In the city of Columbia, we have about 40 people a month coming back from prison. So if we want to look at the most dangerous of those 40, we're probably looking at 1 or 2 people this month, maybe nobody next month, maybe somebody in December. So we're not talking an unmanageable number of people. What we would do is we'd create a city-level supervision program. So in addition to being on state supervision, which is governed by state policy and procedure, and the local district doesn't have a lot of leeway on how they navigate through that, we would develop something locally on how we would hold these individuals accountable, how we would look after them, how would we connect them to resources, and what type of accountability needs to be in place to protect the community and to keep them on the right track. Part of that supervision program would include a team approach. So there would be a police officer that would be designated a reentry police officer that could get to know these individuals personally, could get to know the different resources in the community that could help them succeed, and could also be there to pull the trigger if they decide they're not going to change the way that they behave. A second part of that team would be a community liaison. So this would be an individual in the community that can relate to this individual on their terms. Maybe be the go-between between the police and the offender. Maybe be that person that can connect them to resources and maybe even do a little things, maybe some things that the police are not necessarily aware of, pulling them out of some dangerous situations, whatever it takes to keep these people from reoffending. And the third person on that team would be their parole officer. And this would be the individual that already has a lot of leverage over the individuals because they're on supervision. Another thing that we're recommending with this target population is that they would be required to participate in a program called Pathway to Change, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy program that's offered by the Missouri Department of Corrections. Violent behavior is absolutely always the result, I would say mostly the result, of dysfunctional thoughts. If we're thinking straight, we're not shooting people in the head. So what Pathway to Change is a cognitive restructuring program. It's evidence-based. It reduces recidivism in the state of Missouri. And District 6 Probation Parole has already told us that they have the capacity right now to begin adding these people to the classes that they're already providing in the community so that these individuals can change the way that they're thinking. One of the other recommendations that we're making with regard to reentry, here in the city of Columbia and Boone County, we have a local reentry coalition. It's called the Boone County Offender Transition Network. It's a Missouri reentry process local reentry team. The city of Columbia has yet to engage in this local grassroots effort that meets monthly and has been meeting since, I think, 2006 or 2007. And the city has yet to engage in all of the people in the community, different agencies, different concerned citizens that meet on a monthly basis to address these issues that we're talking about right here tonight. So we would like to recommend that the city designate 2 people to start actively participating in the Boone County Offender Transition Network meetings. One of those would need to be a police officer. The final recommendation that we have that's not on this, because these are new recommendations, you may be familiar with Ban the Box. That was a recommendation that we actually submitted several months ago. That'll be heard at council on December 3rd. Ban the Box, it will be a city ordinance that would remove the felony and criminal history question from job applications and postpone that to a later point in the process. Right now, the ordinance is written that would not be fair game for employers to ask about until a conditional job offer is made. The purpose of Ban the Box is based simply on this. In the state of Missouri, the greatest predictor for success among people that are released from prison is full-time employment. Right now, we know from the research that 2/3 of employers will not knowingly hire a convicted felon, regardless of what the offense is. So what this will do is it'll level the playing field, allow people with criminal histories and felony convictions to at least get through that initial process, at least get to the interview process. And the way the ordinance is written right now, the employers would have complete freedom to look at everybody on an even playing field, pick the person who is most qualified for the job. And at that point, they can run a background check to see if there's a criminal history that directly impacts that employment position. If it doesn't, they would be asked to disregard that. If somebody was writing bad checks and they're the best guy for the position to put shingles on a roof, there's not really a direct connection there. If it's somebody that's applying to work at a daycare and it's a pedophile, nobody's advocating for that. Okay, the employer still has complete freedom on who they choose to hire, but we would like for employers to at least look at all of the qualifications first before they factor in criminal history. Those are our recommendations. Any questions? It's always easy going last. Everybody's ready to get out of here.
Well, I didn't have any questions, but I want to congratulate you. I think your report in some ways, because of the subject, was able to be in some ways the tightest in terms of some specific recommendations.
Absolutely.
And I must admit, I was unaware of the last item, the network. And so my first kind of thing was to say about the city level entry was, why not a countywide? Because so much of the issues around reentry have to do around housing and location, and actually our boundaries and so forth are changing. I must admit, without knowing much about it, it sounds like the city robustly getting involved in the network may really address that problem adequately. Because that's a large enough area, and the 2 departments, Sheriff's Department and the Police Department, to be really quite effective. So again, I want to thank you in general for your work. I didn't know whether it'd be a general thing, so I'll make my general comment about the thing. I am most impressed, not by the recommendations, although that work is good, but by how you all came together, actually self-organized, actually did the work to bond together into a real working team, and that you devoted the time, and this will be straight, you defended the time it was going to take to begin to look into firsthand what kind of was going on. It would have been so easy to go to best practice, these kind of things that quite often don't translate very well. I am amazingly impressed with and I must admit, I heard this from various members because I went to several of the first meetings, that you just took the bull by the horn and said, we're going to get into this and learn enough. We can't know everything, but we really need to get a feeling for that. I think that was a core reason why you bonded. And I think actually that's a real good model for lots of boards and commissions for the city and the county. That kind of initial work So congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just make I do want to introduce the members of the task force who are here. Pamela Harden, Laura Nauser, Dan Hannikin, Chris Haynes, Jerry Taylor, Lorenzo Lawson, David Thomas, Cindy Garrett, Tyree Bindum, Paul Prevost, Chris Campbell, and Steve Calloway. They've really been great to work with, and they've really put a lot into it. If we could give them a big round of applause, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. If anyone has any final comments or remarks on the process as a whole, we'll accept them. Otherwise, some of us will be around after if you want to talk to us individually, but we'll bring this forum to a close. Thank you all for coming out tonight.